Good morning, everyone. My name is Samantha, and as has already been mentioned, I've historically worked on land and women's rights questions. I'm now working through the International Alliance on Natural Resources in Africa to build, in this network, a regional program of work and activism related very specifically to extractivism and the role and impacts on rural women producers. So what I'm trying to do here is talk a little bit around the extractive sector from a feminist perspective, looking specifically at social reproduction and using that as the lens to look at the extractive sector and its impacts, and specifically address the question of women's unpaid labor and how that relates to extractivism. I want to try and move beyond description and anecdotes and sort of build more of a framework of how we can think about extractivism and the relationship of women to that sector. I just want to give a little bit of context because I'm speaking to the region more broadly. In this program, we're building work in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa. But this is a broad regional perspective around Africa's share of mining. In 1984, we're sitting at 19.5, and we can see the predominance mainly of gold in the Africa region. And we see a shift. In 2008, a reduction in the real share of world mining. We can see the massive growth of the platinum group minerals, and that's mainly the South African and Zimbabwean contributions. In terms of Africa's mining production by country, this is in 2008. South Africa still leads by far. But I think if by 2012 we should probably be seeing a stronger presence of Ghana, probably Tanzania probably has moved up the ranking as well. So in 2011, and this comes out of the PricewaterhouseCoopers, which does an annual survey. I think this was the 2012 annual mining review of PricewaterhouseCoopers. These are the financial results for the top 40 mining companies in the region. We see revenues increasing 26% to over $700 billion US. Net profit up 21% to 133 billion. Returned 156% more to shareholders than in 2010. At the same time, yes, market capitalization does fall by 25%. That's very much linked to the financial crisis in Europe and reduced confidence in markets, and mining company share prices do fall hard on the back of this massive profit. But that was in the second half of 2011. Now, again, we're seeing a reduction. In 2010, mining and metal deals in Africa account for 8% of the global total. This is just as multinational corporate profits as a percentage of firm equity. We can see telecommunications, beverages, pharmaceuticals, extractive industries topping them all with massive profits. Now this comes out of the Ernst & Young 2011. They do a comparative assessment of different countries in terms of their openness, their support for mining investment. So Ernst & Young sees a year-on-year growth in FDI to mining in almost all the countries regionally, with the exception of South Africa, Mauritania, and Guinea. I'm not going to go into much detail. I think this might have been addressed yesterday, but the major drivers of growth in the extractive sector is the raw materials demands of BRICS, the emerging economies, growing global energy demands more broadly. Interestingly enough, as new green and mining technologies have arisen, there have been increased demands for the extraction of resources for those. So, for example, the catalytic converters or the nanotechnology. And capital consolidation in the mining sector is also driving this massive growth. The overall context within which investments are being made in the region, very weak regulatory frameworks and tax regimes, incredibly insecure rights. A lot of the mining investment is happening in rural areas under traditional land tenure systems, where communities have very insecure rights under those regimes. And we've seen a lot of corruption and cronyism accompanying these investments as well. The thing that I want to really touch on now, move on to, is the question of climate crisis and the link to the extractive sector. And I think it's important to touch on this because there's a very close link between climate change and extractivism. And the reality is that at this stage, extraction mining is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. And this particularly relates to fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and gas. These are making phenomenal contributions to climate change. So as the resources are being pulled up, we're seeing carbon emissions, but in the processing and refinement of those resources, that is also accompanied by massive carbon emissions. Similarly, with the depletion of forests and lands, including the exploitation of marine resources through mineral extraction in that context, we're seeing the possibility of those as carbon sinks also being compromised. So the world basically is speeding towards a 4 to 5 degree global temperature rise in the next few decades. That's what we're looking at. We need a 50% reduction in northern emissions, and this builds a little on what Mark was saying, by 2020 to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, which is basically the scientific cutoff for sustainability. We need climate debt payments, basically redistribution and acknowledgement of the debt owed by the North and developed countries to the South. We need radically transformed economy, transport system, and energy generation processes. Now, Africa is particularly vulnerable. And Africa is vulnerable because of its ecology, but it's also very vulnerable because of poverty. And poverty basically it creates impediments to people adapting to climate change. And so basically we've experienced a temperature increase of 0.7 degrees during the 20th century. And the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, forecasts that Africa's crop revenues could fall by as much as 90% by 2010. So this touches very much on the questions that Mark was raising around sustainability of agricultural production as climate change is taking place. I just wanted to bring this in here, and this is basically the relative contribution of different greenhouse gases to the heating and cooling of the Earth. On the left-hand side, you can see carbon dioxide and methane are the major contributors to climate change. And carbon dioxide is very significantly produced through the burning of fossil fuels, which is linked to the extractive sector. Methane relates to rice cultivation, sheep and cattle farming, but also mining and oil processing as well. These are just some statistics I came across. It was really hard to find anything in the region. But basically at this stage, the use of fossil fuel currently accounts for 80 to 85% of the carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere. In Australia, in 2011, their climate change department estimated that by 2020 their emissions would surge by 24%, with more than half of that related to mining. Similarly in Canada, where there's a lot of oil sands mining happening, overall emissions will increase by 23% between 2005 and 2020. And then here, this is just the graph on the top, is the billions of tons of carbon dioxide, and that's between 1860 and 1990, contributed by different groups of countries around the world. So for me, the next question is, I've talked a little bit around climate change. What has this got to do with rural women in the region? Basically, rural women carry the burden of climate change. So rural women in Southern Africa are already burdened by their gender and class position. Add climate change to that, and it represents another burden for Southern African women to carry. Basically, 3.1 billion people, or 55% of the total global population, live in rural areas. Of these, 1.5 billion live on less than US $1.25 per day. Women constitute the majority of the rural poor. They own less than 2% of all land and receive only 5% of extension services worldwide. More than 2/3 of the world's unpaid work is done by women, the equivalent of 11 trillion US dollars. And the division of labor, and yes, this does vary from context to context, but the traditional division of labor between men and women results in women carrying the burden of climate change impacts and false solutions. By climate change impacts, I'm referring to desertification, reduced supplies of water, where women have to walk that much further to obtain water supplies, an increased reliance on forest resources, and where forests are being depleted, women are struggling to access the wood for energy production. False solutions, what I'm referring to here is it's questions such as agri-fuels that are being pursued as an alternative form of energy production, as well as, for example, the capturing and marketing of soil carbon. Now, in terms of the extractive sector specifically, in terms of conceptualizing how women's labor is exploited and how women are impacted by the extractive sector, it's really important to distinguish between exploitation and impact at the point of production, and exploitation and impact in terms of social reproduction. So these are just some definitions of how we can think about production and social reproduction. I think we're all familiar by what we mean by production. In the mining sector, we see that there are different modes of production. So in South Africa, we've predominantly got large industrial scale mining, capital intensive mining. That is a growing feature in the region, although we're seeing a lot of petty commodity production, mainly small scale, artisanal and informal mining. That's a little bit on the increase here now with what we would call illegal mining. In terms of social reproduction, I'm going to read this because I think it's really important, because there's very different understandings of what we mean by social reproduction. It basically refers to the processes involved in maintaining and reproducing people, specifically the laboring population and their labor power on a daily and generational basis. What is involved in this is the provision of food, clothing, housing, healthcare, transmission of knowledge and cultural practice. Its meaning is wider than domestic labor. So in a lot of socialist feminism, feminist theorizing, in the early days in the 70s, we were talking about domestic labor, which was basically in the sight of the family. Now we're talking about a much broader concept of social reproduction. Various institutions such as the state, market, family, and community interact, negotiate around power in terms of providing what is needed for social reproduction. And as a concept, it helps us understand the situation of women and their relationship to the economy. So just presenting a little bit further here, sorry. Next. It's really hard to get it there.
Why don't you just use the keyboard?
Okay, yeah.
All technology is sometimes better.
Just, get the keyboard to do that, and then you can go back to the one.
Okay, so in terms of looking at women and their relationship to extraction and how women feature at the point of production and in social reproduction, I've already mentioned, particularly in the region, we have women artisanal or small-scale miners. Basically, these miners sustain millions of people in poorer countries. At this stage, in the research that we're doing, we haven't actually, we're still in the literature survey stage. There's a fair amount of literature on women small-scale miners, which we are surveying at the moment. But then there are important questions coming up for us is, like, what is the role of women in the small-scale artisanal sector? How do women organize themselves? And there's a question for us as to whether there is an alternative for women. lying in the small-scale mining sector. Then the second way in which women appear in the productive side of the extractive sector is where women work underground. This is less of a feature in the region. It's predominant in South Africa, where we have the mining charter setting out a 10% target for women miners. In the region, in fact, until recently, women who work underground has been banned as a practice. Now, women who work underground experience multiple exploitations as workers, so alongside male workers, they experience the same challenges of poor pay, danger, exploitative working conditions. However, they experience particular challenges as women workers. So the whole sector is set up to support male mine workers in terms of change rooms, safety, the question of maternity, how women deal with pregnancy and maternity leave. In fact, some of the mines have basically put a ban on women falling pregnant. So there are enormous constraints to women working underground. And then at a community level, for example in Marikana, the women who work in the mines are very marginalized in the community. They're basically seen as sex workers. And this is related a little bit to the feature of transactional sex that happens underground. But they're marginalized by women who see them as a threat to their relationships to their husbands or partners. And they are vilified by male community members who see them as a threat to male jobs. So this question of sexual harassment and pressure from communities that women workers experience is a great challenge. I've also mentioned this question of transactional sex. It's a major issue. Women workers are very much stuck at the bottom of the rung, the labor hierarchy, and women supplement their earnings by selling their bodies underground. So you actually find, and I think David, their research has shown this as well, condoms on the mining shaft floors. At the end of the month, women are selling their bodies underground to earn a little bit more cash. Then in terms of social reproduction, I think many of you might be familiar with the multiple impacts that we see of mining. In terms of women in the Africa region are the primary producers and processors of food in the small scale and subsistence farming sectors. With mining, what happens is we see massive land grabs. In the labor sending areas, the men are leaving, whether that's Lesotho or Zimbabwe or the Eastern Cape, as we've seen with Marikana. The men are migrating and leaving women and children to support subsistence farming systems with minimal labor. And I think what's happened is that as we've seen a massive move to investment and support for extraction as a development channel, we've seen the terrible neglect of land reform and support for small-scale agriculture in the rural areas. The second major impact, and this is really significant, is the increase in unpaid care work for women. And one of the things we're working on at the moment is a silicosis. It's related to all these silicosis court cases against gold mining corporations. But what we're doing is we're working on this from a gender-specific angle. We're building an argument that silicosis that affects male miners has very particular impacts on women. When the male mine workers are infected with silicosis, which is a disease of the lung, and they return home, it is women's unpaid labor that is then being used to care for these mine workers as they are ill and when they die. And so there's massive impacts in terms of women's unpaid care work, including that of children, who carry a lot of the burden of this unpaid care work. Polluted water supplies, deforestation in receiving areas, in the areas where the mining is happening, also increases the burden of work for women. And where we see interrupted education and healthcare services that accompany forced removals, the burden of then tuition and support for sick children, etc., falls upon women's unpaid labor. Again, this last point around women and transactional sex, in all mining impacted communities, this is a great feature. There's been very little research done on this. It's impossible to find any specific research on this question. We're certainly going to keep on digging, and we hope to be able to undertake research ourselves on this question. but it raises important questions around HIV, STDs, and women's ability to control their bodies. And in fact, in Marikana, it's been quite horrifying that there has been some indication of Mozambican women having been shipped in and working as sex slaves, servicing male mine workers. And this is something that I think needs further investigation and work. The last point I want to make around social reproduction, and this is a very specific challenge that needs to be considered going forward, but because a lot of the mining is happening in areas where there are traditional communities, there are very important questions that are coming up around the question of consent as it particularly applies to women. So there are major challenges to communities and the right of consent, which we refer to in the sector as free, prior and informed consent. This is a struggle that we're waging in countries around the region, is the right of communities to give their consent, which includes saying no when they do not want mega projects happening in their local communities. And there are very specific challenges for women because of power hierarchies in rural communities and the fact that women are generally excluded from traditional decision-making structures, including the challenges of power within households themselves. Now, this focus on production and social reproduction as an organizing framework for understanding the impacts of and the relationship of women to the extractive sector has been critiqued as perhaps too much of a dualistic framework. And so one of the things going forward is we want to really think a little bit more about how we can theorize better as we are doing this research, the links between production and reproduction. And some socialist feminists have started to speak about the need to refer to expanded mode of production model, which does away with this dualism of production and social reproduction, where at the point of production, it's very much seen as a site of labor, a contribution to economic growth, and it's seen as very masculine, that the point of production is predominantly male workers. Whereas the site of social reproduction, even though we're talking about contributions from the state, market, families, is still seen very much as a feminine space, and the primary mode of that being the family. So we will do continued work on that to theorize further. Some basic conclusions. The emergent theme definitely is crisis. We've got climate crisis, we've got the crisis of social reproduction, and we've got the crisis of unemployment and eroded livelihoods. And these are very particular, these are impacts that are very particularly felt and carried by rural women. What lies at the center of the crisis? At the local level, in communities impacted by mining, there's immediate crisis. We've got the crisis of polluted water supplies, pollution of air, we've got forced removals from land, we've got neglected investment in agriculture. So those are some of the immediate crises that get created. But as we all know, this is part of a much larger system, and I think what Mark was challenging us to do earlier was to start to imagine beyond this. So the larger system fuels this primitive extractivism, and basically the features of it are competition, a pursuit of limitless growth, rampant consumption across the world, profit without limits. This system itself separates humans from nature, creating a domination of humans upon nature. Nature becomes a commodity, assets that we use to fuel growth and development for human beings. Nature becomes a commodity to be traded and profited from. The system is deeply dehumanizing, and so we're basically reduced to consumers and we become the means of production. And it has particular sex, gendered, and racialized dimensions because, as I've already explained, it's the bodies principally of black rural women that are carrying these brutal impacts of extractivism and its effects. I want to talk a little bit about women's resistance to extraction. We're still trying to map out and understand the different ways in which resistance is happening regionally. There's an amazing international women in mining network called RIM, and these members are engaged in different forms of struggles. So the members of RIM are worker organizations, indigenous groups and civil society groups, and they campaign against mining-related exploitation. They've been around since 1997, and they have an international secretariat in India. We see some organizing of women mine workers through the unions, but what's become very obvious in South Africa around NUM and AMCU, as well as other sort of smaller unions, has been that the issues and needs of women workers are very marginalized. They're barely recognized, and the unions are not really responding to them. There are smaller local and national efforts where women are organizing around the impacts of extractors. So, for example, in Kenya, there are small-scale women miners that are organizing in the gemstone sector. In Kenya as well, there's a lot of organizing of women locally around forestry as a form of extraction. In South Africa, there hasn't been that much. I've been very involved with Marikana Women Unite, which was an organizing effort that evolved post the massacre. That organizing continues, and the women of Marikana are working in solidarity with women in other mining impacted areas, as well as women that are struggling around issues of privatization of water, electricity, access to housing in urban areas. So these are just some nice images of women in struggle. The Rural Women's Assembly that was at COP17 this last year, December. A couple of other images of women in struggle. I just want to conclude on the point of this whole framework of thinking around social reproduction, I think, offers us alternatives as well. Why do I say this? Basically, if we're thinking about how human beings are reproduced, it's the reproductive workers, it's women, it's indigenous people that are looking after their forests, it's small-scale farmers that are farming for subsistence and a little bit for market on a daily basis. But they basically, through their labor, through their work, they are creating the means of production, but they're also taking care of nature and the planet. So it's very interesting because La Via Campesina, which is a global movement of small-scale farmers, their campaign position around COP17 was small-scale farmers are cooling down the earth. Because small-scale farmers are farming sustainably. They're not using pesticides and fertilizers. They're working at a small scale, using local labor, with a lot of systems, food systems work. Small-scale farmers are selling their products locally, so we're not having to transport goods across countries and boundaries and so on. So if you just look at one area of what I'm referring to, small-scale farmers, their ways of working, the way that they produce and the way that they relate to nature, they are preserving. No, they're not even just preserving or reproducing nature, they're actually regenerating nature. So there's something about the ways in which, if we think about social reproduction, and about reproducing human beings with a very different relationship to nature, I think it starts to offer us alternatives, different ways of thinking about how we produce, distribute, and consume. The same thing can be said for forest dwellers, who are basically preserving the forests, which are sinks for carbon. Reproductive workers, because of where they are located, they are much closer to nature. So it's where humanity and nature meet, in the forests, on the farms, the people that are fishing sustainably. And so in the way that they are organizing, the way that they're producing, they offer us an alternative economics and an alternative knowledge that places at the center ecological sustainability. And so if we look, it is really the contradiction between profits and social reproduction, this ongoing contest between workers and corporations around wages and around benefits. So with workers fighting for better wages and more benefits to support social reproduction, and corporations pushing back and trying to minimize wages and benefits to increase their profits. So that underlies many social struggles. But in a sense, it's in that contest itself, which is very much about the fight for social reproduction, that lies the solution to the multiple crises. And so for me, a reproductive focus brings into light the possibility of just eco-sustainable existence, which really is our only hope for planetary and human survival. Thank you.